For more than 3 decades, Toni Braxton has possessed one of the most recognizable voices in modern R&B. Deep, smoky, elegant, and unmistakably emotional, her voice turned heartbreak into something almost beautiful. Millions knew the songs. Millions watched the performances. Millions saw the glamorous dresses, the award show appearances, the sold-out concerts, and the effortless confidence of a woman who seemed born to stand beneath the spotlight. But the version of Toni Braxton the public saw was never the whole story. Behind the velvet voice and polished image was a woman carrying battles that rarely fit neatly into a 3-minute song. There were financial struggles, frightening health problems, complicated relationships, professional disappointments, and moments when the future she had worked so hard to build suddenly seemed uncertain. And now, at 58, Toni's story feels different. Not because she has suddenly become someone else, but because the pieces of her life that once seemed disconnected are beginning to make more sense. The heartbreak in the music, the periods when she stepped away, the health struggles she could not simply perform through, the relationship that repeatedly confused fans, the private decisions she kept away from cameras. For years, people wondered what was really happening behind the scenes. Perhaps the most surprising thing is that the truth was never one dramatic secret. It was an entire life lived under enormous pressure. Toni Braxton's rise began with the kind of success most singers can only imagine. When her self-titled debut album arrived in 1993, she quickly became one of the defining voices of the decade. Songs such as Another Sad Love Song and Breathe Again introduced audiences to a singer whose voice sounded mature, wounded, and powerful all at once. Then came the song that would permanently change her career. Unbreak My Heart. The ballad became more than a hit. It became Toni Braxton's signature. Her performance sounded so emotionally convincing that listeners felt as though they were hearing someone reveal the most painful moment of her life directly into a microphone. The success was enormous. But success can create an illusion. When audiences see someone collecting awards, selling millions of records, and appearing on magazine covers, they naturally assume that money, stability, and happiness follow automatically. Toni would eventually discover how misleading that assumption could be. Her career included financial crises that shocked fans who could not understand how an artist with such massive record sales could experience serious money problems. Toni openly discussed bankruptcy and the complicated economics of the music industry, where enormous sales do not necessarily mean an artist personally receives the enormous fortune the public imagines. It was one of the first moments when the glamorous image began to crack. Yet money was only one battle. Another was taking place inside her own body. Toni has spoken publicly about living with lupus, an autoimmune disease that can affect different organs and create serious complications. For an entertainer whose livelihood depended on traveling, rehearsing, recording, and performing night after night, the diagnosis changed the rules of her life. Suddenly, strength was no longer simply about determination. There were things ambition could not control. There were days when her body demanded something her career did not want to give her: rest. For years, Toni's health problems became part of a private balancing act. The public might see a glamorous performance, but behind that appearance could be medical appointments, exhaustion, medication, and the constant need to monitor a condition that could become dangerous. Eventually, one particular health scare became terrifyingly serious. During medical monitoring connected to her lupus, doctors discovered a major problem involving her heart. Toni later described how frighteningly close she had come to a potentially devastating medical emergency before undergoing a procedure to address the blockage. Imagine that moment. You are Toni Braxton. Your voice has filled arenas. Your records have sold around the world. You have survived career disappointments that once seemed impossible to overcome. And suddenly none of it matters. Not the awards. Not the chart positions. Not the applause. Because a doctor is telling you that something inside your body could have changed everything. Experiences like that alter the way a person understands time. They can change what matters. They can change relationships. They can change what someone chooses to reveal, and what they decide is no longer worth hiding. And somewhere inside Toni Braxton's already complicated life was another story fans had been trying to understand for years. His name was Birdman. To many people, the pairing seemed unexpected from the beginning. Toni Braxton represented sophisticated, emotional R&B. Birdman was one of hip-hop's most recognizable executives and personalities, a man associated with Cash Money Records and an entirely different corner of the music industry. On the surface, they looked like an unlikely couple. Yet their connection went deeper than many outsiders realized. Their friendship stretched back years before romance entered the picture. Eventually, friendship became something more. Public appearances followed. Then came engagement rumors, confirmations, uncertainty, apparent separation, reconciliation, and repeated questions from fans about whether the relationship was actually over. Every time people thought they understood Toni and Birdman, another chapter seemed to appear. At certain moments, Toni appeared determined to keep the most personal parts of that relationship away from public scrutiny. And perhaps that should have been the biggest clue. Because while fans were debating whether Toni Braxton and Birdman were together, separated, engaged, or finished for good, something far more significant had already happened away from the spotlight. Something Toni did not immediately share with the world. Something that would eventually force people to reconsider almost everything they thought they understood about their relationship. After decades of singing about love, loss, loyalty, and heartbreak, Toni Braxton had made one of the most important romantic decisions of her life almost completely in private. And when the truth finally emerged, it revealed just how little the public had really known. Because the story of Toni Braxton and Birdman was never simply about whether they stayed together. The real story was what happened when almost nobody was watching. For years, Toni Braxton and Birdman seemed to exist inside a relationship that outsiders could never fully decode. One moment, they appeared inseparable. The next, fans were wondering whether everything had fallen apart. There were engagement announcements, rumors of separation, public confusion, and long stretches when neither Toni nor Birdman seemed interested in explaining exactly what was happening between them. To anyone watching from the outside, it looked unstable. But that interpretation may have missed something important. Toni Braxton has always understood the cost of allowing the public too far into her private life. She had already spent decades watching headlines reduce complicated experiences into simple narratives. Financial problems became scandal. Health struggles became speculation. Relationships became entertainment. Eventually, protecting certain parts of her life may have become less about secrecy and more about survival. That is what makes what happened with Birdman so fascinating. Because behind all the uncertainty, the relationship apparently continued moving forward. And in August 2024, Toni Braxton and Birdman quietly got married. There was no enormous celebrity spectacle designed for television. No months-long publicity campaign. No endless countdown to the ceremony. For a woman whose career had unfolded in front of millions of people, one of the biggest moments of her personal life happened with remarkable privacy. The public did not immediately understand the significance of what had taken place. And perhaps that was exactly how Toni wanted it. After decades of having nearly every major triumph and setback discussed publicly, she had chosen to protect something deeply personal. But the story did not become simple after the wedding. In fact, it became even more complicated. Not long after the marriage, Toni filed for divorce. For fans who eventually learned about the legal filing, it created another round of questions. Had the marriage collapsed almost immediately? Had years of uncertainty finally caught up with them? Was the relationship that had survived engagements, rumored breakups, and reconciliations finally finished? From the outside, that conclusion would have seemed obvious. But Toni and Birdman's story had never followed the obvious path. The divorce proceedings did not ultimately bring their relationship to an end. The filing was later withdrawn, leaving the marriage intact. Once again, the couple had done what they had repeatedly done before. They surprised everyone. And that pattern says something important about Toni Braxton's life at 58. Her story is not the story of a woman whose life unfolded according to a clean celebrity narrative. It is messy, human, sometimes contradictory. She has known extraordinary success and financial collapse. She has stood beneath glamorous stage lights while dealing with serious illness. She has sung some of the world's most famous songs about heartbreak while quietly navigating a relationship few people fully understood. And perhaps that is why her journey continues to connect with audiences. Toni has never simply represented perfection. She represents survival after perfection disappears. There was a time when the public image of Toni Braxton seemed almost untouchable. She was the elegant superstar with the impossible voice. But behind that image was a woman learning that success could not protect her from illness, money problems, family tension, disappointment, or uncertainty in love. At some point, every celebrity discovers that fame solves fewer problems than people imagine. For Toni, that realization came repeatedly. Her lupus diagnosis alone forced her to reconsider how she treated her own body. The entertainment business rewards people who keep going. Another show. Another interview. Another flight. Another appearance. Another performance. But chronic illness does not care about schedules. It does not care that thousands of people bought tickets. It does not care that a television crew is waiting. When the body reaches its limit, everything else becomes secondary. Toni has spoken about the seriousness of lupus and the importance of medical monitoring. That monitoring ultimately became critical when doctors discovered dangerous heart complications. The frightening part was not simply that something was wrong. It was how easily the problem might have gone unnoticed. That experience appears to have reinforced something Toni had already learned through decades of struggle. Tomorrow is never guaranteed. And when someone has faced that reality, priorities can change dramatically. Perhaps relationships are no longer judged by how understandable they look to outsiders. Perhaps privacy becomes more valuable than public approval. Perhaps happiness does not need to be explained. That may be one reason Toni and Birdman's relationship has remained so difficult for the public to interpret. People wanted a simple answer. Together or separated. Happy or unhappy. Married or finished. But real relationships rarely fit into those categories so neatly. Especially relationships that have lasted through years of changing circumstances. Toni herself had already lived through another major marriage. In 2001, she married musician Carrie Lewis, a member of the group Mint Condition. They welcomed 2 sons, Denim and Diesel. Their relationship eventually ended, with the couple separating before finalizing their divorce years later. Motherhood became one of the defining parts of Toni's life. And one of her sons would introduce another challenge that deeply affected how she viewed herself, her family, and her responsibility as a mother. When her younger son, Diesel, was diagnosed with autism as a child, Toni entered an entirely different emotional world. She later became an outspoken advocate for autism awareness. But behind the public advocacy was a mother facing questions that millions of parents understand. Was I doing enough? Could I have noticed something earlier? What will his future look like? Those questions had nothing to do with fame. They were simply the fears of a parent. And as Toni's career continued, these private battles kept accumulating. The world heard the voice. Toni lived the consequences. That distinction becomes essential to understanding her at 58. Because what appears from the outside to be the life of a legendary singer is, from the inside, something far more complicated. A woman fighting to protect her health. A mother protecting her children. An artist trying to maintain control over her career. And a wife who, after years of questions and speculation, ultimately chose to keep one of her most important relationships largely on her own terms. But even the secret marriage was not the deepest turning point in Toni Braxton's story. Long before Birdman became part of the mystery, Toni had already experienced a humiliation so enormous that it nearly destroyed the glamorous image the world had created around her. At the height of her fame, while millions assumed Toni Braxton must be incredibly wealthy, she was heading toward bankruptcy. And the truth behind that collapse was far more complicated than most fans realized. At the height of Toni Braxton's fame, almost no one looking at her from the outside would have imagined that money could become one of the darkest chapters of her life. She had hit records, Grammy Awards, television appearances, designer gowns, a voice recognized around the world. From the public's perspective, Toni Braxton looked like the definition of financial success. But behind the image was a reality that would eventually shock millions. In 1998, Toni filed for bankruptcy. To many fans, the news seemed almost impossible to understand. How could one of the biggest R&B stars of the decade, an artist connected to millions of record sales, suddenly be facing such serious financial trouble? That question would follow Toni for years. And the answer exposed one of the entertainment industry's most uncomfortable truths. Selling millions of records does not necessarily mean an artist personally receives millions of dollars. Record labels, managers, producers, promotional costs, advances, touring expenses, taxes, and contractual obligations can dramatically reduce what eventually reaches the performer. From the outside, the numbers look enormous. From the inside, the financial structure can be brutally different. Toni would later speak openly about the frustration she felt during that period. Imagine hearing your songs everywhere. Walking into restaurants and hearing your own voice. Watching your albums climb the charts. Seeing your face on television. And then looking at your personal finances and realizing that the success everyone believes has made you rich does not feel anything like financial security. For Toni, it became one of the most humiliating contradictions of fame. She was rich in recognition, rich in awards, rich in cultural influence. But the financial reality behind the curtain was far less glamorous. The bankruptcy threatened more than her bank account. It threatened her identity. Toni had spent years building herself into a sophisticated superstar. Suddenly, headlines were no longer only discussing her music. They were discussing debt, contracts, money, failure. The woman who had once seemed untouchable was now being publicly examined through one of the most vulnerable moments of her life. But Toni did something that would become a recurring pattern throughout her story. She kept going. She returned to music. She returned to performing. She rebuilt. Her career continued, but the lesson never completely disappeared. And years later, financial trouble returned. Toni faced another bankruptcy proceeding in 2010, proving that the first crisis had not been an isolated chapter. By then, however, something else had changed. Toni was no longer simply the young superstar trying to understand how success could coexist with financial instability. She was a mother, a woman dealing with health problems, a performer attempting to maintain a demanding career while her body increasingly forced her to recognize its limits. This is where the different parts of Toni Braxton's story begin to connect. Financial trouble is stressful for anyone. But imagine dealing with serious debt while also facing medical uncertainty. Imagine wondering whether you will be healthy enough to tour, whether insurance will cover what you need, whether another medical emergency could interrupt your income, whether the career you depend on financially is also demanding more physically than your body can safely provide. For Toni, these pressures were not separate. They overlapped. And yet when she appeared on stage, audiences expected the same Toni Braxton they had always known. Elegant, controlled, powerful. There is something almost cruel about celebrity in that way. The audience sees the performance, They rarely see what happened 10 minutes before the curtain rose. They do not see the phone call from a doctor, the legal document, the family argument, the sleepless night. They simply see the star. And Toni learned how to become that star even when her private world was far more uncertain. Perhaps that is why her music has always carried such unusual emotional weight. When Toni sang about heartbreak, listeners believed her. When she sang about regret, the emotion felt lived rather than manufactured. Her greatest songs sounded vulnerable because vulnerability had become part of her reality. But money and illness were not the only areas where Toni's public image collided with private pain. Her family life would eventually become entertainment too. When Braxton Family Values premiered in 2011, audiences suddenly gained access to a world that had previously remained mostly behind closed doors. Toni was no longer simply Toni Braxton the superstar. She was Toni the sister, Toni the daughter, Toni the mother. And the Braxton family was complicated. There was love. There was loyalty. But there was also competition, resentment, disagreement, old wounds, and the kind of tension that can develop when one family member becomes internationally famous while others are struggling to establish identities of their own. Toni's sisters, Tracy, Tawanda, Trina, and Tamar, each had their own ambitions and personalities. The television series transformed the entire family into public figures. At first, fans were entertained by the arguments, jokes, confrontations, and emotional conversations. But underneath the reality TV format was something deeper. The Braxton sisters had once performed together before Toni's solo career exploded. Her success changed the family forever. That did not mean her sisters did not love her. But fame can create distance even inside the closest families. When one sibling becomes globally recognized, the balance changes. Suddenly, comparisons become unavoidable. Who received the opportunity? Who was overlooked? Who sacrificed what? Who was treated differently? Questions like these can remain buried for years. Reality television has a way of bringing them to the surface. And Toni, who had spent so much of her career carefully protecting her image, suddenly found her family's most personal conflicts becoming part of public entertainment. But no disagreement, bankruptcy, or career setback would compare with the loss that eventually struck the Braxton family. Because in 2022, Toni and her sisters faced something no amount of fame or money could repair. Their sister Tracy Braxton died at only 50 years old after battling cancer. For a family already marked by complicated relationships and years of public scrutiny, the loss changed everything. And for Toni, it was another brutal reminder of a lesson her own health had already taught her. Time can disappear much faster than anyone expects. The death of Tracy Braxton changed the emotional landscape of the Braxton family. For years, viewers had watched the sisters argue, reconcile, compete, laugh, cry, and try to navigate the complicated combination of family and fame. On television, their conflicts could sometimes look dramatic or even entertaining. But grief stripped all of that away. When Tracy died in 2022 after battling esophageal cancer, she was only 50 years old. Suddenly, old arguments felt smaller. Old resentments mattered less. And the Braxton sisters were forced to confront something far more permanent than any disagreement they had ever shown on television. One of them was gone. For Toni, the loss carried an especially painful weight. She had already lived for years with the knowledge that her own health could become dangerous without warning. Lupus had forced her to think about mortality in a way many people do not until much later in life. Now mortality was no longer an abstract fear. It had entered her family. Tracy's death was a reminder that no amount of fame could protect them from the most basic realities of being human. Awards could not stop cancer. Success could not reverse time. And public recognition could not make grief easier. Toni had spent much of her life learning how to perform through pain, but some losses cannot be performed away. There is no stage large enough to escape them. No applause loud enough to silence them. Grief follows you home. And for the Braxton family, Tracy's absence became part of every future gathering. This is important when trying to understand Toni at 58. Because by this stage of her life, she was no longer simply dealing with one crisis. She had accumulated decades of them. Financial setbacks, career uncertainty, a chronic autoimmune disease, serious heart complications, the end of her first marriage, the responsibilities of motherhood, family conflict, and now the death of a sister. Each experience changed her. Perhaps that is why Toni's approach to privacy appears more deliberate today than it did during the early years of her career. When she was younger, the public largely knew her through music videos, interviews, and carefully produced appearances. Then reality television opened another door. Fans began seeing the family arguments, the disappointments, the personality clashes, the emotional confrontations. It made Toni seem more accessible, but it also showed her what happens when personal pain becomes public content. Millions of strangers begin forming opinions about moments they only partially understand. And once that happens, controlling the narrative becomes almost impossible. That may help explain why Toni became so protective of certain parts of her relationship with Birdman. From the outside, their romance seemed full of contradictions. They had known each other for years. Their friendship eventually became romantic. They became engaged. Then rumors of a breakup emerged. At different points, fans were unsure whether they were together at all. And every new public appearance created another wave of speculation. But the more people tried to understand the relationship, the less Toni seemed interested in explaining it. That silence created mystery. It also created rumors. Some fans assumed the relationship had ended permanently. Others believed the couple remained together, but simply preferred privacy. Then came the development that almost nobody expected. Toni and Birdman married quietly in August 2024. The significance was enormous. This was not merely another celebrity romance rumor. After years of uncertainty, they had made the relationship legally official. And yet, instead of turning the wedding into a publicity event, Toni kept the moment largely private. For someone who had spent much of her life in front of cameras, that choice spoke volumes. Maybe she had learned that not every important moment needed an audience. Maybe some happiness felt safer when it belonged only to the people actually living it. But then, once again, the story took an unexpected turn. Months after the wedding, Toni filed for divorce. For anyone watching from the outside, it appeared to confirm every suspicion that the relationship had always been unstable. Years of breakups, years of uncertainty, a secret wedding, and then divorce papers. It seemed like the final chapter. Except it wasn't. Toni later withdrew the divorce filing. The marriage remained intact. And once again, the public was left trying to understand a relationship that refused to follow a predictable celebrity script. Was it reconciliation? Was it a temporary crisis? Had the couple simply decided that whatever difficulties existed were worth working through? Only Toni and Birdman truly knew everything that happened to TUC 752D privately. And that is precisely the point. For decades, audiences had grown accustomed to believing they understood Toni Braxton because they knew her songs. Then they believed they understood her because they watched her family on television. But knowing someone's public story is not the same as knowing their life. At 58, Toni appeared increasingly willing to make that distinction. She could acknowledge the marriage without explaining every conflict. She could celebrate love without pretending relationships were simple. She could reveal part of the truth while keeping the most intimate details for herself. And perhaps that was the real evolution. The younger Toni Braxton had been presented to the world as a superstar. The older Toni Braxton had survived enough to understand that being understood by everyone was no longer necessary. But one question remained. Why had Toni continued returning to Birdman despite years of uncertainty? To answer that, you have to look beyond the headlines and back to the foundation of their relationship. Because long before there was an engagement ring, a secret wedding, or divorce papers, there was something far less dramatic. There was friendship. And that friendship may explain why the relationship survived moments that would have ended many others. Long before Toni Braxton and Birdman became one of the most unexpected celebrity couples in music, there was something quieter between them. Friendship. That detail changes the way their entire relationship looks. From the outside, people often focused on how different they seemed. Toni was associated with elegant R&B ballads, emotional vulnerability, and a polished public image. Birdman was known as a powerful hip-hop executive, a founder of Cash Money Records, and a figure whose career had been built inside a very different culture. To many fans, the pairing appeared almost impossible. But relationships are rarely built on public branding. They are built on what happens privately. Conversations, trust, history, the ability to be present when cameras are gone. Toni and Birdman had known each other for years before their romance became public. That history mattered because Toni had already experienced enough instability in her life to understand the value of familiarity. By the time their relationship became romantic, Toni was no longer the young singer experiencing fame for the first time. She had survived bankruptcy. She had raised children. She had experienced divorce. She had faced lupus. She had endured serious medical scares. She had watched family relationships become reality television. And she had experienced the loss of her sister. At that stage of life, love can look very different. It may not be about finding someone who fits the image other people expect. It may be about finding someone who already understands the complicated person behind the image. That could help explain why Toni and Birdman continued finding their way back to each other even after periods of uncertainty. Their engagement became public in 2018, and for a time, it seemed as though the next step would be obvious. A wedding. But then came confusion. Rumors suggested the relationship had ended. Social media activity fueled speculation. Fans wondered whether the engagement had collapsed. And because Toni and Birdman did not provide a constant stream of explanations, every silence created another theory. That pattern continued for years. Together. Possibly separated. Seen again. Then private again. The relationship became almost impossible to categorize. But perhaps the public was asking the wrong question. Instead of asking, why can't they make this relationship work? Maybe the better question was, why do they keep choosing each other? That is a very different question. And it becomes more interesting when viewed alongside Toni's health struggles. Living with a chronic illness changes how a person experiences relationships. There are moments when energy disappears. Plans have to change. Medical appointments become part of life. Fear can arrive unexpectedly. A partner is no longer simply someone who appears beside you at events. They may become the person who sees the most vulnerable version of you. That matters. Toni has spoken publicly about the seriousness of lupus and how important it became for her to monitor her health carefully. For years, she had tried to continue being the performer audiences expected while quietly managing a condition that could affect multiple parts of her body. Then came the heart scare. Doctors discovered a dangerous blockage in one of her coronary arteries. Toni later explained that she required a procedure involving a stent. The experience was frightening because the problem could have become catastrophic if it had remained undetected. That kind of moment can divide a life into two parts. Before you knew. And after. Before, tomorrow feels automatic. After, tomorrow feels like something you were lucky enough to receive. For Toni, the medical scare added another layer to a life already filled with reminders that control can disappear quickly. Perhaps that is why the public version of success seems less important to her now. At 58, she does not need to prove that her life is perfect. She has already lived through too much for perfection to be believable. The more compelling truth is that she kept going. And that may be the real meaning behind the phrase, finally reveals what we all suspected. Not that Toni had been hiding one sensational secret, but that the glamorous woman the world had watched for decades was far more vulnerable than her image suggested. Her voice had always sounded like someone who understood pain. Now fans understood why. She had not simply performed heartbreak. She had experienced it in different forms. Romantic heartbreak, financial heartbreak, family heartbreak, physical vulnerability, and the fear of losing control over a body that had carried her through decades of performances. Yet Toni never allowed those experiences to become the final definition of her life. That is what separates her story from the kind of tragedy people sometimes imagine when they see an aging celebrity. Toni Braxton did not disappear. She adapted. She found new ways to perform. She continued recording. She remained connected to television. She continued speaking publicly about health. And even after decades in an industry that had given her both extraordinary success and extraordinary stress, she continued to stand in front of audiences. That persistence becomes even more remarkable when you remember how early she was warned that revealing a serious illness could affect her career. For an entertainer, health is not only personal. It can become professional. Insurance, touring, contracts, scheduling. People begin asking whether you can still do the job. That can create enormous pressure to remain silent. But silence has a cost too. Eventually, Toni began speaking more openly. About lupus. About her heart. About fear. About the importance of medical screening. And in doing so, she revealed a side of herself that was far removed from the superstar image created in the 1990s. This Toni was not trying to appear invincible. She was telling people that survival sometimes depends on admitting that you are not. And that lesson would become even more powerful when Toni looked back on the one moment doctors told her could have ended very differently. Because according to Toni, if she had delayed that medical appointment much longer, the story of her life might have changed forever. For Toni Braxton, the most frightening chapter of her health journey did not begin with screaming pain or a dramatic collapse. It began with a medical checkup. That detail is what makes the story so unsettling. Toni had already been living with lupus for years. She understood that the disease required attention, monitoring, and discipline. She had learned that feeling relatively normal did not always mean everything inside her body was normal. And eventually, that vigilance may have saved her life. During medical testing, doctors discovered a serious blockage involving one of the arteries supplying blood to her heart. Toni later spoke publicly about the experience and the procedure she underwent to place a stent. For someone who had already dealt with years of health uncertainty, the discovery was terrifying. But what disturbed her most was how close she might have come to something much worse. There had been temptation to postpone medical care. Life was busy. Work continued. Responsibilities did not disappear simply because she had lupus. That is how people often live. They tell themselves they will make the appointment later. After the project. After the trip. After the deadline. After life becomes less complicated. But life rarely becomes less complicated on its own. For Toni, that routine medical monitoring uncovered something that could not safely be ignored. Suddenly, the woman famous for singing "Unbreak My Heart" was confronting a frightening reality involving her actual heart. The irony was impossible to miss. For decades, audiences had associated Toni Braxton with emotional heartbreak. Now she was dealing with something physical, immediate, and potentially life-threatening. It transformed the meaning of survival. Toni had survived bankruptcy. She had survived professional setbacks. She had survived divorce. She had survived years of public scrutiny. But none of those battles mattered if her body could no longer carry her forward. That realization seems to sit underneath much of the way Toni now talks about health. She no longer treats lupus as something that needs to remain hidden behind glamorous photographs. She has used her visibility to encourage awareness, particularly around regular medical care and listening to warning signs. That openness represents a remarkable evolution. Earlier in her career, illness could feel like a professional liability. The entertainment business is built around reliability. Can you tour? Can you perform? Can you complete a television schedule? Can you appear night after night? A chronic illness introduces uncertainty into every one of those questions. And uncertainty can frighten an industry built around contracts, schedules, and money. So Toni learned something uncomfortable very early. Being vulnerable could have consequences. That may explain why she became so skilled at presenting strength even when things behind the scenes were anything but stable. Yet by 58, Toni no longer seems interested in pretending strength means never being afraid. Her version of strength is different now. It means showing up for medical appointments. It means admitting when something is wrong. It means understanding that survival sometimes requires slowing down. And perhaps most importantly, it means accepting that she does not need to control what everyone thinks about her. That lesson reaches far beyond health. It also helps explain her relationship with Birdman. For years, people wanted Toni to provide a clean explanation. Were they together? Were they broken up? Were they getting married? Had they canceled everything? Why did they keep returning to one another? Toni never gave the public every answer. And when she ultimately married Birdman privately, that choice seemed to demonstrate how dramatically her relationship with fame had changed. The young Toni Braxton built a career by letting millions of people hear her emotions. The Toni Braxton of today understands that revealing emotion through music does not mean surrendering every private moment of her life. Some things belong to the audience. Some things belong to her. That distinction becomes more meaningful when you consider everything she has lost. Her sister Tracy's death brought mortality painfully close. Her own heart scare had already done the same. Her financial struggles taught her that wealth could disappear. Her career setbacks taught her that popularity could change. Her marriage and divorce taught her that relationships could transform. And motherhood taught her that life would always involve responsibilities greater than celebrity. Maybe that is the real revelation. Toni Braxton did not reach 58 untouched by the events behind her. She reached 58 shaped by them. The woman audiences see today is not simply the same superstar who emerged in the early 1990s. She carries decades of victories and wounds. Some visible, many invisible. And still, she continues. That may be more powerful than any scandal. Because celebrity culture often teaches audiences to expect two endings: triumph or collapse. A star either stays on top forever or becomes a tragic story about what went wrong. Toni Braxton fits neither narrative. She fell. She rebuilt. She struggled again. She loved. She lost. She became frightened. She became private. And then she continued forward. There is something deeply human about that. At 58, Toni is not revealing that her life was secretly perfect. She is revealing almost the opposite. The glamorous image was only one layer. Behind it was someone who had repeatedly been forced to begin again. But there is one final piece of Toni's story that changes the way everything before it should be understood. Because after the illness, the bankruptcy, the heartbreak, the loss of her sister, and years of uncertainty surrounding Birdman, Toni did something that many people did not expect. She stepped back into the spotlight, not as a woman desperately trying to recreate her past, but as someone who finally seemed comfortable carrying every chapter of it with her. And that is where the real Toni Braxton story reaches its most surprising conclusion. After everything Toni Braxton has survived, perhaps the most remarkable thing about her story is not what happened to her. It is what did not happen. She did not disappear. She did not allow bankruptcy to become the final sentence of her career. She did not allow lupus to permanently remove her from the stage. She did not allow divorce to convince her that love was finished. She did not allow family tragedy to erase the joy that remained. And she certainly did not allow the expectations of strangers to dictate every decision she made. At 58, Toni Braxton is still here. That simple fact carries more weight when you understand everything behind it. For audiences who discovered her during the 1990s, Toni will forever be connected to a particular image. The short haircut, the glamorous gowns, the unmistakable contralto voice, the emotional performances, and, of course, Unbreak My Heart. But Toni Braxton became much more than the young woman standing beneath dramatic lights, singing about heartbreak. She became a survivor of the very kind of emotional turbulence her music had always described. The difference was that real life did not end when the song ended. There was always another morning, another decision, another medical appointment, another financial problem, another family conversation, another reason to continue. And somewhere along that road, Toni seems to have stopped needing her life to make perfect sense to everyone watching. That may be the biggest change of all. Celebrity culture demands explanations. When a famous couple separates, audiences want to know why. When they reconcile, people want to know what changed. When a celebrity disappears from public view, fans immediately speculate about what happened. And when someone keeps an important event private, curiosity becomes even stronger. Toni's relationship with Birdman became a perfect example. For years, outsiders tried to define it. Engaged, separated, reconciled, finished, back together, married, heading toward divorce, still married. Every development seemed to contradict the one before it. But perhaps that apparent contradiction was simply evidence that the public was seeing isolated fragments of a much longer relationship. Behind the headlines were two people with years of history. And when Toni eventually allowed more of that story to become visible, it confirmed something fans had suspected for a long time. Birdman had never been just another brief chapter in Toni Braxton's romantic life. Whatever difficulties existed between them, their bond continued surviving moments when many assumed it was finished. Their private marriage made that unmistakable, and the withdrawal of the divorce filing added another unexpected layer. But the real revelation goes deeper than a wedding certificate. It is about the woman Toni became. When she entered the music industry, control over her career often belonged to other people. Record companies controlled contracts. Executives controlled budgets. The industry controlled expectations. Doctors later forced her to confront limitations she could not negotiate away. Reality television allowed millions of people into her family's private world. Over time, Toni learned what she could control and what she could not. She could not control lupus. She could not control every headline. She could not prevent every financial setback. She could not stop the passage of time. She could not bring Tracy back. But she could decide what parts of herself the world was entitled to see. That is why Toni Braxton, at 58, feels different from Toni Braxton at 25. The younger Toni was trying to establish herself. The older Toni has nothing left to prove about whether she belongs. Her legacy is already written into R&B history. Millions of records sold. Multiple Grammy Awards. Songs that continue to resonate decades after their release. A voice that can be recognized within seconds. But legacy is not only about numbers. Sometimes legacy is about what a person survives long enough to understand. Toni's story reminds us that success does not provide immunity from ordinary human suffering. A Grammy cannot protect a heart. Money cannot guarantee stability. Fame cannot prevent grief. And a love song cannot teach anyone exactly how to make a relationship work. Behind every legendary performer is a person who eventually has to go home when the applause stops. For Toni, that private world has included far more pain than the glamorous photographs ever revealed. And yet it has also included resilience, motherhood, family, love, reconciliation, and the determination to continue performing even when life repeatedly gave her reasons to retreat. Maybe that is why her voice still carries so much emotion. When Toni sings about losing someone, audiences hear more than technique. They hear experience. When she sings about wanting someone back, the words feel heavier. When she sings about survival, she no longer needs to imagine what survival looks like. She has lived it. At 58, Toni Braxton has reached a stage where the woman matters as much as the superstar. Perhaps more. And after decades of speculation, heartbreak, illness, and questions about what was really happening behind closed doors, the truth turns out to be far more compelling than any rumor. Toni Braxton was never invincible. She was simply incredibly good at continuing when life proved that she wasn't. She faced financial collapse and rebuilt. She faced chronic illness and adapted. She faced terrifying heart complications and became more vigilant about her health. She faced divorce and eventually allowed herself to love again. She lost a sister and carried that grief forward. And when the world demanded answers about Birdman, Toni ultimately chose how much of that story she wanted to tell. Maybe that is what everyone had suspected all along. Behind one of R&B's most powerful voices was a woman carrying far more than anyone could see. A woman who had been hurt. A woman who had been frightened. A woman who had made mistakes. A woman who had changed her mind. A woman who had learned that privacy can sometimes be more valuable than publicity. And most importantly, a woman who refused to let her most painful chapters become her ending. At 58, Toni Braxton's greatest revelation may not be a scandal at all. It may simply be this. After spending decades singing about broken hearts, she finally learned that being broken and being finished are two very different things. And Toni Braxton is far from finished.